Diablo 4 takes the storied franchise in a new direction, and after spending 30 hours roaming the fractured peaks of Sanctuary, it's clear we've got a lot to talk about. My name is Kodiak, this is Legacy Gaming, and today we're sharing our brutally honest impressions of the Diablo 4 open beta. Diablo 4's open beta was our first look at the new Sanctuary. We got to explore one of the 5 major zones, Fractured Peaks. We explored over a dozen dungeons scattered across the world. We even got a taste for the story that will unfold on June 6. While the experience was fun and there's plenty of potential, it's clear the game isn't for everyone. We'll talk about that too. Before we get into it, I just want to say we'd love to hear how your experience with the open beta was. Leave us a comment down below. What do you like? What don't you like? And what do you hope changes before launch? If there's one change to the Diablo format that absolutely works, it's the shift to an open world. For years, we've been saying that Diablo needs to lean more into MMO territory, and while they're inching that direction, the shift in how they approach world design makes a noticeably massive difference. Simply put, the Diablo experience doesn't feel like it's on rails anymore. It's still linear in its main story, but there is so much more freedom to explore. Tackle side quests, experience events, pretty much what you'd expect from an MMO. Once we have access to the entire world of Sanctuary, I think this experience is only going to get better. Most of the systems we experienced are tied together in one way or another, so the idea of completing an area and never coming back to that area is really a thing of the past. Hands down, this is one of the best decisions the Diablo team could have made, and while some people may not like the open world format, it's clear that it's opening up a whole new world of possibilities for the team. On top of that, the world design itself, the aesthetic of Sanctuary, feels spot on, and while we've only had access to the Fractured Peaks, the dark and dreary theme that was so prominent in Diablo 2 is very much the inspiration for Diablo 4. If you remember, Diablo 2 was one of the few games at the time that had an M rating, and I think that's inspired the team this time around to really push the boundaries of what players see and experience. I obviously don't want to spoil anything, there's something to be said about exploring every dungeon and creepy crypt yourself, but to sum it up, I felt like Diablo was getting back to its roots, and that's something I appreciated. Now, having an immersive world is only one aspect of the game. A big creepy world is only as good as the player experience once you're actually exploring that world. And one thing our team was largely focused on during the open beta was combat. Let's be honest, it's at the very center of the Diablo experience, and if the team doesn't manage to get that right, well, the rest doesn't really matter. To level set quickly, myself, Livid, and Schmo experienced all 3 classes available, Barbarian, Sorcerer, and Rogue, at level 25, the cap for the beta. In terms of the moment-to-moment gameplay, combat is incredibly fluid and, in our opinion, the best it's felt in a Diablo title to date. The pace of the action is consistent, but the speed of the moment-to-moment combat really depends on your class. In our opinion, this does help things feel less arcadey and more realistic, or as realistic as it gets fighting massive demons. The action itself is crisp, and that's complemented by the game's approach to enemy design this time around. Every enemy comes from a specific enemy family, and within that is a hierarchy that's important to understand as a player. That's always been the case to a degree, but the team more clearly defined enemy roles in Diablo 4, and that helps in the heat of battle as you choose what targets to prioritize. Not everything is a memorable encounter, but because a vast majority of the enemies are well designed, that synergizes well with the combat experience, which is part of the reason why it feels so fluid. On top of that, you can't ignore the skill tree system, which is so intimately linked to the combat experience. At face value, the skill tree structure is well designed. As you level up, you allocate points, and after a certain number of points are spent, you gain access to a new category of abilities, reflective of the class you're playing. Major skills can be unlocked and then augmented, and the tree itself forces you to make important decisions about how you enhance abilities, which will hopefully lead to more diversity of builds once we have access to the endgame. It's a really well thought out system, and while not quite as vast and expansive as some other ARPGs, this skill tree system is accessible while still not being so simple as to put off some of the more hardcore players in the genre. Sadly, no matter how amazing the system is, I think certain metas will always rise to the top. That's just the nature of this genre, and while there is choice, it's limited. I would love to have seen more choice when it comes to enhancing abilities, because that would have forced players to think even more about how to allocate their points. Right now, the choice to enhance a skill is either option A or option B, and while that's fine, the whole system would have benefited from just one more layer of depth. What is great though is the ability to quickly adjust your skills no matter where you are in the world, and while I'm still not in love with the idea of paying massive amounts of gold to respec, I think I've been pretty clear that it's a slippery slope. The level of freedom the developers give players to tailor their build on the fly is fantastic, especially during the leveling experience. I was constantly tweaking my early game build, experimenting with different skills and enhancements, and if I didn't have that flexibility in the field, I wouldn't have explored the class to its full breadth. However, it's not all good news. One issue we ran into was the desire to quickly switch between different skill setups based on if we were playing solo or in a group. There's no way to easily swap full loadouts, which means you have to respec and spend time and gold fully allocating all of your points to match your current situation. This was really apparent when our squad of 3 level 25s decided to knock out some dungeons together. We needed to adjust to account for each other, but there was no easy way to do that, and it felt like we were almost being punished for making changes. It was either respec for gold or bring useless skills to the group experience. Both choices felt bad. Once reaching level 25, the combat experience did open up, and as I said before, the open world allows you to explore whatever content you want at your own pace. As you might expect, our team was eager to dive into some dungeons, and with over a dozen available to us during the beta, it was a great showcase of one of the pinnacle Diablo experiences. For starters, the art direction is fantastic. As I mentioned before, those dark themes are carried into the dungeons and amplified even more. The art team clearly had fun creating this game, including some twisted places for players to explore. Now, unfortunately, the ambition of creating over 150 dungeons within Diablo 4 did force the team to cut some corners, and it was clear after the 3rd or 4th dungeon that assets and layouts were reused. This isn't a deal breaker in our eyes simply because there are a lot more dungeons and tile sets that will be available at launch, and there's only so much you can expect when you're aiming for such an ambitious instance experience, but where we did take some issue was the repetitive boss design. There are some fights, like the Den Mother in Light's Watch, that was just superb. An incredible aesthetic mixed with a simple but effective moveset, and overall satisfying to complete. Sadly, that's not the case with every dungeon, and some boss fights featured reskinned monsters with maybe a variation on its established moveset. It would have been nice to have a custom, unique experience to end each dungeon, but again, we understand that there has to be some give and take when your ambition is to create so many fully fleshed out dungeon experiences. We just expected a bit more after 10 years of development. What was a pleasant surprise was the rewards for completing a dungeon. Not only are legendary drop rates well balanced, at least on the veteran difficulty which we had access to, but the brand new Codex of Power system gives players a great reason to complete every dungeon within the game. If you don't know, for completing each dungeon you unlock an aspect, which is a special passive effect that can be imbued onto an item at the occultist. Each dungeon rewards a different aspect for completing it, and since the system is account-wide, it's the perfect carrot on a stick to get players to engage with content the team has created. Eventually, dedicated players will collect them all, but if there are 150 dungeons, and each dungeon takes around 15 minutes to complete, you're looking at nearly 40 hours of aspect hunting, and that's only one experience within the game. The aspect system is also superb from a build perspective. It's a great way to give players more control over their character, and because the system actually has some decent depth to it, it's not a guarantee of ultimate power. Let me explain. Aspects are just some of the available legendary powers in the game. If the team gave you access to everything, there would be no reason to farm for gear. Some gear has effects that can't be unlocked with the Codex of Power. However, if you find a piece of gear with an effect that you like, you can go to the occultist and rip that aspect off the piece of gear and imbue it onto something else. This allows for even more build flexibility and will be an important aspect of the endgame class builds. It's easily one of the most well thought out systems in the game and clearly the focus of some serious development, and it shows. I'm excited to see just how important the system becomes once we have complete access to the game post-launch. Outside of dungeons, there are a number of world events scattered around Sanctuary. These are part of the shared world experience the developers talked so much about ahead of the beta. Again, let's be clear, this is where the team is flirting with MMO territory, but why shouldn't they? Because it works. Players don't necessarily need to group up to take part in these, they can simply run into an event area and start engaging with the content, which is varied. Hopefully someone else is running by and also wants to try and tackle the event, because trying to complete these alone and complete the mastery, a special challenge that rewards you with a better event prize, is pretty tough. Overall, I do like these though, mainly because they're quick, engaging, and different than some of the experiences found around the other parts of the game world. I actually wish there was more to entice players to complete these. Loot is good and obviously the driver for a lot in the game, but it would be cool if something uniquely tied to the event was implemented. One event I can't sing the praises of enough is the world boss system. During the open beta, we got to take on Ashava, and it was a really fun experience. The camera zooms out to account for the boss's absolutely massive scale, and alongside about a dozen other players, we got to take on this large foe. Luckily, we were successful at defeating the boss and we were rewarded with a healthy dose of legendaries. But if you weren't lucky enough to be randomly instanced with other skilled players, it's very possible you might never actually get the kill. Y'all are gonna hate me for this, but the world boss system makes it clear that Diablo 4 needs a more robust party system, or even some sort of looking for group system. At the end of the day, everyone wants a chance at completing content, and leaving that up to fate because the system of the game is limited doesn't seem like a good enough excuse to not develop something better. Ultimately, world bosses have a lot of potential to be fun, engaging content, but without the infrastructure there to support taking down these large enemies, I'm afraid it's going to end up turning off a lot of players. Without making this video 45 minutes long, it's hard to talk about every single system in the game that we had exposure to, but what we just covered were highlights in our mind. The 15-ish hours we each spent with the game flew by, and that's just a sign that we're having a good time playing Diablo 4. So far, the experience isn't weighed down by bloaty systems, the freedom to explore gives us a level of autonomy we've never had in a Diablo game before, and overall, the combat and class experience is solid up until this point, and even though we've only had that limited exposure, things are trending the right direction. That being said, it's time to look at the game from a more critical place and talk about the things we didn't like. From a macro perspective, there's a lot we love about Diablo 4. The team has been smart about what systems to keep, tweak, or scrap from previous games, and the way more systems are linked together is something I don't think we should undersell. That being said, there are some things, both minor and major, that just aren't clicking for us. First, touching back on combat is the way the resource system is balanced in the game. All three classes we had access to, and I'd imagine all of them, including the Druid and Necromancer, are forced to use builders to generate a resource that can then be used on spenders. What this ultimately means is that no matter the class, you're forced to always allocate a few points on these sort of vanilla abilities just there so that you can tap into more powerful skills. This does create a weird ebb and flow within combat, and that might be ironed out as we level up more, but it's a glaring issue at the lower levels. Unfortunately, this is a direct result of the skill tree being designed the way that it is, and while we do like it, by creating a sort of linear path from basic skills all the way down to ultimate skills, you are creating a structure that encourages this sort of system. You're limited in the overall flexibility with skills because you'll always have to consider how to build up your class-specific resource. This may not be an issue for some, but for us it throws a wrench in an otherwise fluid combat experience. While not directly tied to combat, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the community's biggest complaint about the game during the open beta, the lack of an overlay map. Now, I personally don't feel it's necessary, but I do know it took Livid a minute to adjust to not having it available at the push of a button. In his mind, the biggest issue is that by removing the overlay map, you remove the ability to fluidly move throughout the world while still being able to navigate on a larger scale. The current minimap simply doesn't allow for that. Strangely enough, this is just a product of the genre. ARPGs have always had this sort of map overlay system, and for Diablo, the game that I believe invented the idea to strip it completely out of its newest game, feels weird. This is either going to go one of two ways. Players will complain so much that the developers add it post-launch, or the community will simply get over it. Either way, this issue was amongst the most talked about during the open beta, and it's worth mentioning. Another thing that bothered us were the restrictions around trading, especially in group content. I think we can all appreciate the team's attempts to try and curtail any sort of black market for selling gear and creating a scenario where real money influences the game, but to completely limit trading of legendaries in all situations seems to be an overcorrection. As I alluded to, where this is the biggest issue is in group content. While loot is instanced for your current class, it would enhance the co-op experience if players could trade gear that they don't need, at least for a limited amount of time. There's also something to be said about bind on account items and how loot could be used across multiple characters. That would require loot tables to be completely opened up in-game, but it's something to consider. At a bare minimum, it would be nice to trade with other players of the same class for a limited amount of time, especially if you're doing group content together. It doesn't seem like a bridge too far, and if done correctly, it doesn't expose the system to exploitations. I also think Diablo 4 is fighting against itself when it comes to the presentation of information, and while that may sound boring, it's a crucial part of the player experience. What this boils down to is font consistency. You'll notice a lot of mixing between serif and sans serif fonts, and community-wide, this has sparked quite the conversation. Luckily, Livid is a graphic designer by trade, so he was able to really help me understand the issue. Now, according to him, the issue isn't about the mixing of fonts, it's the consistency and hierarchy of displayed information. This nav section in the top right highlights the issue clear as day. There are 4 different fonts in this section alone, and nothing stands out when trying to determine the structure of the information. The Crucible, level 25 up top, doesn't need to be in the serif font when right next to it is sans serif font. If you're going to use a serif font, especially something like the iconic Diablo font, like in the quest name, it needs to be the most prominent element, with the sans serif font smaller and supporting the most important text. Right now, everything conflicts and it all reads the same. Now again, it may seem like a small issue, but priority of information is a huge factor in a game like this where info is constantly being hurled at players, and if the devs don't address it ahead of launch, it could cause confusion and even some frustration with players across the board. So where do we stand on Diablo 4 after playing around 30 hours during the open beta? Honestly, we're pretty optimistic about the game. There are definitely some issues, but you can't judge the entirety of a book after reading just a few chapters. You have to take the thing cover to cover to get the full experience. Now, I understand many of you don't want to pay that premium price tag $70 for the base game. I totally get that, which is why I encourage you to not only watch our content, but other creators that are covering the game too. Look at the game for what it is, not what people want it to be, and hopefully you can make a determination if it's worth picking up for yourself. As it stands now, the Diablo 4 experience we've had up until this point is solid, and while a number of systems are still a mystery, such as Paragon points and the endgame loop, just to name a few, we're curious enough to give the game a shot on June 6. Friends, we hope you're enjoying our Diablo 4 coverage. If the game is on your radar and you want more content like this, including deeper guides and eventually some fun builds, hit that like button and consider subscribing. We also plan on opening up a Diablo 4 clan once the game goes live on June 6, so if that's something you're interested in, consider joining the Legacy Gaming community on Discord. Our open beta clan filled up quickly on day one, so keep an eye on chat and be sure to stay tuned for more information come launch. My name is Cody Atkin from everyone here at Legacy Gaming. Thanks for watching, and play on.